There are 100 weapons that were added to the game with Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. And I've been surprised at how many of them are genuinely awesome. It doesn't seem like they're there to just pad out numbers or be filler. Alright, a couple of them, maybe not that great. But many of them are not only powerful, but genuinely worth using. The DLC also brings a lot of fun new weapon classes. For example, light greatswords, for people who don't need to overcompensate with a colossal greatsword. Or great katanas for people who do need to overcompensate. There's the martial arts and their associated stances. And of course, there are the backhand blades, which have been absolutely carrying me through the DLC. I don't know if these are objectively the strongest weapons in the game, but man, they feel like the strongest weapons in the game to me. And so that's what I'm here to talk about today. How to get the backhand blades, how I've been using them, and the success I've been having. With that said, some of the most fun that I've had in Elden Ring is experimenting with different weapons. I love when I'm fighting a boss, hitting a wall, just being able to pull out something else and absolutely clap them with it. That moment where I go from, I'm gonna die 50 more times to, oh, I did it in 2. So as I continue through the DLC, I'm gonna try more weapons and I might find something else that I fall in love with. So if you want to see more on that, get subscribed, maybe leave a like while you're down there. For now, let's start with how to get the 3 backhand blades available in Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. As a note, if you only have a base game, you can't access these weapons. They are exclusive to the DLC. So the first weapon you'll find in this class is simply called Backhand Blade. It has reach that's slightly better than a dagger, but slightly worse than a straight sword. You can kind of think of this as a curved sword, except edgier because you hold it backwards like all those rogues that you saw who were really cool and edgy and wore black, and were probably goth. So if you want to roleplay as a goth rogue, all you gotta do is go to this coffin in the gravesite plane and loot it. Now of course, it isn't here anymore because I looted it and I've been using it for quite a while now. But this is very easy to get, you don't have to fight any bosses, you don't have to fight anything at all really. And you'll have an insanely powerful weapon. The backhand blade is upgraded with regular smithing stones, which means it can be infused and you can swap the Ash of War. Not that you'll want to, because Blind Spot is totally awesome. Blind Spot causes you to dash to the side, then strike an enemy. This hits hard enough to stagger most foes, and as you dash to the side, you can often avoid their attacks instantaneously. Just do be a little careful using it on bosses, because if you use it the wrong way, instead of dashing out of their attack, you will dash directly into it and take a ton of damage. Now, it requires 10 strength and 13 dex, but it is primarily a dexterity scaling weapon, which means if you go keen, yes, you can get S-rank dexterity scaling. Though personally, I prefer going for a dex arcane build and actually infusing it over to blood, because this weapon hits incredibly quickly. Plus, it's a paired weapon, so when you're two-handing it, instead of actually two-handing it, you simply draw a second blade and dual wield it. This gets around the whole needing 2 copies of a weapon if you want to go dual wield. But you get all the advantages of striking incredibly quickly. The backhand blade results in an absolutely prodigious amount of damage output. For example, here's me using it against the Lion Dancer, and for me personally, this was the second Remembrance boss that I defeated. I had originally gone into it with the Eleanor's pole blade, and I was able to get phase 1 down pretty good, but phase 2 and 3 kept getting me killed. So I swapped things up and I changed to the backhand blade, and oh my god, it was such night and day. Not only did I have just as many bleed procs as with the Eleanor's pole blade, but I was able to easily dash around some of his attacks. Again, that's using the blind spot. Furthermore, because the weapon strikes very rapidly, especially if you're only one-handing it rather than two-handing it, you're able to really get in, get out, abuse jump attacks, pretty much whatever you want. It's a very flexible playstyle. But the only thing it's not great at is poise breaking, which makes sense because it's not a big old clunky heavy weapon. And so after swapping to the backhand blade, I was able to take the Lion Dancer down within a half dozen tries. And since then, it's been my go-to weapon for pretty much any tough enemy in the game. Though again, because I like experimentation, I have swapped here and there. And if you need even more proof, I took my backhand blade against the Godskin duo. I came across them while climbing around in crumbling Ferrum Azula, desperately attempting to get enough somber and smithing stones via the bell bearings to upgrade all the new weapons that I found. I started on the Eleanor's pole blade, struggled with it, felt like it wasn't working, swapped to the backhand blade, and well, this was my first and only attempt. You can see for yourself how it went. But now that I've talked about my favorite backhand blade weapon, there's actually two more. The Smithscript Cirque and the Curseblade Cirque. These function a little bit differently. Overall, they're kind of the same. Lots of fast attacks, there's even some bleed affinity. They're primarily dex weapons, though it does vary a little bit. But it also feels like the Cirques don't have quite the same range as the backhand blade. So first up we have the Smithscript Cirque. This is a strength, dexterity, intelligence, faith weapon. Though it again most heavily scales off of dexterity. This is extremely good if you're on New Game Plus, as you can keep putting more and more and more attributes into it to keep pumping up the damage. As a quad stat weapon, the min-maxing here is incredible. With that said, because I'm not on New Game Plus and I'm much lower level, I have more limited stats. Personally, I didn't really like playing with a Smithscript Cirque. In terms of the Ash of War, it's the same blind spot as the regular backhand blade, and it's also upgraded with regular smithing stones so it can be infused and buffed. To obtain it, you need to go into the Ruined Forge Starfall Past. Then head through the area, unlocking the doors as you go, until you find a body with a couple of golems by the edge of a waterfall. Don't jump off a waterfall, that'll kill you, but do grab the weapon and then, well, either jump off a waterfall or leave via the door as the golems madly chase after you. Really, whatever you prefer at that point. As a Smithscript weapon, there is one other interesting property to the Cirque. That is, you can throw it, specifically both the heavy attack and the jump heavy attack. Execute a strike where you throw the weapon and they curve towards the target. This can be very good, as it makes your attacks much more medium range rather than close range, but it can be bad as, well, it can cause your attacks to miss the enemy if you're at just the wrong distance. Personally, I've tried a couple different setups with this, and my favorites are either A, just going keen for the S-rank dex scaling. In this case, you want pretty much as much dex as you can get and then other stats, or alternatively, actually swapping it over to cold. That way I can use it as an offhand weapon to get frostbite procs. And of course, in a situation like that, I'm pairing it with a different backhand blade in my main hand. Now last up is the Curseblade Cirque. This backhand blade is by far the most annoying to get, because it drops from Curseblade enemies. You know, those guys that jump down and absolutely destroy you. How I got mine was going to the very first Site of Grace, where you enter the Lands of Shadow, running up to the Horn Scent that promptly destroyed me at first, swapping to the Rakshasha's Great Katana, and just spamming the Weed Cutter. Weed Cutter gives super armor, so it couldn't really stop me from doing this, and I had enough damage and enough health that I could tank its hits while whittling away, and eventually getting the kill without having to deal with silly nonsense like dodging its attacks. Is this a good strategy that I recommend to people? I mean, I recommend killing it a bunch of times if you really want the Curseblade Cirque, but no, I don't recommend just brute forcing it like I did. Now, the Curseblade Cirque has a different moveset, which in some ways is better and some ways is worse versus the other two backhand blades. The primary difference is this is a somber weapon, so it cannot be infused and you cannot change the Ash of War. Second of all, the weapon skill is Deadly Dance. This unleashes an absolute flurry of blows, which is very efficient at staggering enemies. It's also pretty good for AoE damage, and it gets you decent bleed procs. The downside is it's not blind spot, so it doesn't quite have the same level of mobility. And this is another strength dex weapon. The main difference between this and the default backhand blade is it has an innate bleed proc at 45. It scales a little bit harder into dex without any infusion, but ultimately won't scale as hard into dex as the other two because, well, you can't ultimately infuse it, thus you can't modify the scaling. So I've tried all of these weapons quite a bit now. I first tried them on an arcane heavy setup that was originally built to use Eleanor's Poleblade or Rivers of Blood. So obviously, I had to infuse them and I had to focus on statuses. This felt pretty darn limiting, actually. You can kind of get away with it on the Smithscript, especially if you're using it as an offhand weapon, but as your primary, it's not really going to be your best choice. You are much better off going with the Keen. And again, you can't use an Ash of War to infuse the Curseblade Cirque. So I ended up using the backhand blade the most, and this continued even after I swapped over to Dex. Now, if I was on New Game Plus, maybe I was level 300, I had plenty of scaling to spare, there's a chance I'd be leaning towards the Smithscript here. But because I'm only around level 160 and my stats are actually spread out so that I can try a lot of different weapons, I have a bit of int, a bit of faith, a bit of strength, and then a lot of dex, a little bit of arcane, I ended up going with a blood-infused backhand blade. This provided the best balance of those nasty bleed procs to take out huge chunks of a boss's health, which was absolutely crucial on a fight like Mesma, with the raw upfront damage that I needed to take down small enemies quickly without having to actually proc my bleed before I can do significant damage. The attacks on your Backhand Blade flow one into another, making it very easy to chain them, so do watch your stamina bar and make sure you don't deplete it. Also, ultimately, I found that I really enjoyed having the blind spot, which meant the Curseblade Cirque was automatically out of a running since it has a different Ash of Warren that can't be swapped. And I'm still going back and forth on the infusion. Keen versus Bloody. Occult out. It's only good if you're really heavily invested into Arcane, and honestly this isn't the best weapon for super heavy Arcane scaling. Keen with high dex gives you the upfront damage needed to take out lesser enemies almost instantaneously, whereas Bloody excels on bosses, and since bosses are where I've struggled primarily, though admittedly some of the trash mobs in the later part of the game seem to have infinite poise and are basically just mini-bosses, for the most part I have been focusing on the Bloody version, and only really swapping to Keen or Frost or any of the other infusions in situations where the enemy is either bleed immune or significantly resistant to my damage. Though in some cases, I'll just grab a different weapon that I happen to have prepped, such as Rivers of Blood against fire-weak enemies or Great Star against strike-weak enemies. Again, my gameplay style is very much swap things around, find something that works, as opposed to just sticking with one weapon and maining it. Also, fun fact, if you use the Mimic tier summon, then you kinda get the Black Knife Tiche we have at home. Your summon will aggressively attack enemies, and yes, continually proc bleed using the Backhand Blades. Again, at least if you have the Bloody infusion. I've also noticed that it's surprisingly good at utilizing the blind spot to deal damage to enemies, possibly even staggering them, as opposed to just getting in the way of their attacks. And so that's why I think the Backhand Blades are the best new weapon class added in the Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, or at the very least they're my favorite. But just to add in some anecdotal evidence, a friend of mine was struggling on the last boss of a DLC, he saw me playing Backhand Blades with a bleed build, he copied my build, and he killed it shortly afterwards. And so if a playstyle suits you, at minimum they're viable for all the content, but more likely they're excellent for it. And I'm really curious if people come up with some massive damage cheesy builds on the Smithscript Cirque using New Game Plus stats. And so that I'm curious, have you tried many of the new weapon classes, and if so, which ones have you found success with, and which ones have you found failure with? So far, I've tried the light greatswords, and unfortunately I don't really have great stats for any of them, so I've only been okay. The great katanas, I have a love-hate relationship with them, which is to say, I love them until I hate them because they attack just slightly too slow, and I overestimate my attack speed because I'm used to the Backhand Blades. And the martial arts stuff, I thought I wasn't going to like it. So far, I've actually found it to be very enjoyable, though it's super close range, so you gotta be really careful about the engagements. But I'm also curious some of your thoughts, so do be sure to leave them down below. And by the way, if you need more Elden Ring news and guides, head over to MaxwellGG, link will be down in the description. If you're looking for more Elden Ring content, maybe check out how to easily beat furnace golems, or some of the weapons that I found when I first started exploring the DLC. Spoiler alert, the Backhand Blade is in there, and I was already singing its praises. I'll link those videos up in the card and down below. Of course, before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. Link to support is down below. And a big thanks to everyone who watched to the end. I'm glad you enjoyed the video. Good luck in your Backhand Blade builds. Hopefully if you decide to farm the Curseblade Cirque, it takes you less than the 2 hours that it took me. And so with that, good luck, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next video.